What's happening, fam? L.A.R. movement still moving. Book is entitled Lessons from a Non-Custodial Father at Amazon, Kindle, and Create Space. A link will be in the description box below as usual. These three videos are going to be entitled An 80s Baby's Point of View. Childhood first, right? It's the first one. Growing up is quote unquote an 80s baby, right? Looking back at it, when people compare childhoods and kids ain't what they used to be, blah, blah, blah. Well, I got to think about it. Like, being a quote unquote 80s baby, it was like a hodgepodge of things that happened because you were in the same household, in the same family with people who were in Jim Crow, Vietnam and the Civil Rights Movement, after the Civil Rights Movement, where black people were quote under attack, and the Woodstock free love sexual revolution type thing, the black exploitation part, and you were a kid coming up with all those different upbringings and situations, so you got like the best of all the worlds in a sense, because they were imparting to you the things that happened, so I remember having those experiences where spirituality was taught more so than religion, because when my grandparents went to church, it wasn't as dissected as it is now. Even though they knew some of these things then, the connection was with a higher power as far as spirituality is concerned. They believed the same thing, so a man thinketh, so he is. So if you believe in God and you think, God will provide, that's where he don't come when you call, but he's always on time kind of thing happens. And part of the black excellence was part of my childhood, because you didn't realize that being black was negative because you had so many people around you that was doing so well. People forget that the 80s babies were kind of the crumbling of black business and how can I say this, integrating to through culture vulture stuff. So I still knew the colleges, the predominantly black colleges, and all the what you would consider pro-black info, which back then it wasn't really pro-black. It was just teaching your kids that there were black people who did great things that they wouldn't teach you about in school. I remember, when people talk about we grew up in poverty, I didn't know we was poor. A lot of friends who we knew didn't know we were poor. I think that only kicked in about knowing that you were poor after like watching Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous for a while. You get what I'm saying? You wasn't living like them, so then but as far as knowing if you were rich or poor, you didn't know. Every kids was just happy to be kids, and you were, you got what you wanted, and when you asked for too much, you didn't get it. So it was just part of life, right? Being in the 80s, I remember being, just like I was talking about excellence, I remember the worst thing to be was a dummy. Like, people didn't like you being dumb or playing dumb. Like, that was just like, no good. And I'm not talking about just school smart. I'm just talking about life smart, common sense smart. And I take some of these things with me today as I look back on them. I remember not having all of these propaganda issues with television and media, because I remember not the 80s were the changing of the guard. because people forget it was like Shalimar. I think Michael Jackson first, when cable first was popping or whatever, that was breaking new ground, you know, because black people were on MTV, you know. I think even BET started in the 80s, if it came out in the 80s too, if I ain't mistaken. I believe so. So we had that part of it. Another thing about the 80s that I remember is you would see more and more black faces. So as a kid, like I said, we enjoyed being kids to the point where we got the best of doing household chores, because I remember my grandparents didn't want me to grow up like them per se, as far as having to drop out in grade school to provide for the family. So we got to live a childhood, but to be raised by a generation of people like that, we still had to work hard. And I think that's sometimes what's missing today, because they let you be a kid, but once they taught you right and wrong, they let you make your decisions and deal with your consequences. You were taught right and wrong and manners, but you was able to be a kid. And people weren't as fearful as they are today about things happening to kids. Because I remember in the 80s being virtually pretty safe. Like if something happened out of line, it was crazy. And I remember being smart because, you know, my grandmother, I lived with my grandmother for a time, and she had a heart attack. And I was the only one in the house, so I was the one that had to call the ambulance. So I knew, you know, 911, call, calm, cool, collected, you know, here's the address, come, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I remember that as a kid. And it was because I was raised by groups of people who were older and wiser, and they expected things from children. So you could still be a kid, but they expected you to not just freak out if something were to happen in an adult situation. Because we're talking about people who used to have to raise their own siblings as kids. You know what I'm saying? One thing I remember about being an 80s baby, I remember also having a lot of the dueling classes between what we would call the black family structure and the crack era. You know, and a lot of people didn't really peep that at first. You know, because everybody, we had family, our family had issues, all families have issues, but there was a bond regardless. But there was also consequences and choices, right? You know, I remember having to, how can I put this? To come in the house when the street light came on. You know, you can be a kid, you can go out and play. You can have other kids, boys can do boy stuff, blah, blah, blah. You can go, you play at school, you have fun. You know, I remember being ridiculed for being smart. Not just by kids, not necessarily in the 80s by kids, but more so by teachers. You know, I didn't realize the issue with that until I got older. I remember knowing, like, being taught things like, mean what you say and say what you mean. You know, look people in the eyes when you talk. Have a firm handshake. I remember having hair and never combing my hair because I was a little boy running around playing, and my grandmother tricking me every night to come watch TV with her, and I would fall for it every night. She'd lock her legs around me and comb my hair, and it was hell getting that comb through. But it taught me things like you got to keep yourself groomed. I remember having school clothes and play clothes, and you know, making up the bed and being able to express yourself. I remember having, like, the era we see with all these hero movies. I remember Spider-Man had a TV show and Wonder Woman had a TV show, and then you had people like T.J. Hooker and Hawk and all that had a TV show. You still was watching Sanford and Son, and that was the thing. And even All in the Family, which we didn't really watch, but even, you know, they had the Michael Jackson action figures and the G.I. Joe, and there was always somebody black that you could see in the 80s, even as a kid, to make you think you were just part of the world. Like, and when they didn't make, and when they didn't have somebody black, I remember we had Superman was popping in the '80s, and I remember in New Orleans they had Sunman, so it was a black equivalent, right? So you could play with Sunman, and I remember our parents buying us stuff like that, Buffalo Soldiers and stuff like that. And I remember moving to the DMV, which is District of Columbia, Maryland, Virginia. It's Maryland, D.C., whatever you want to call it. I remember living there when Doug Williams was the quarterback to the Super Bowl winning team, and how big of a deal that was for people. And you didn't realize necessarily the struggles of being black as a child in the 80s, but you knew it was different. That's what I talked about it before, where I said that was my first time when I was living in Maryland. They had a kid who got shot in D.C. playing with toy guns by a police officer, and that's when they started changing the colors of the guns and the cap guns and blah blah blah, because people knew that the dude probably knew it was a toy gun, but it was a black kid. So you started getting those things. I remember the early lessons about telling us, you're gonna have to work twice as hard as white kids. You're gonna have to be twice as smart as white kids. So instilling that stuff in us early so we know to combat racism just with skill and excellence. And you didn't really think about it as much. I remember, having family get-togethers, the kids singing in front of the family and performing with the family, and be in front of the TV and thinking I was Michael Jackson. And I remember a little kid stole my Michael Jackson Thriller action figure. And I said this before in one of these videos. I'll find you. I'm grown now. I'm going to kick your ass. But I remember having the music growing up in the households, because it changed all my perspective as I got older. I'm going to get into that when I get to adulthood. I remember the music being good, but I had to grow into learning the messages, because it was coded, because it was so much. They had good manners, to the point where they'll make a song and the country had better decorum, even though it started deteriorating, So I remember jamming "Give It to Me, Baby," and I would play "Give It to Me, Baby" now, even with my godchildren when they were younger, and I could play music like Rick James and Marvin Gaye and the old Michael Jackson and the Gap Band, and kids would just gravitate to it because everything was in there, I remember having a community who would help people, your neighbors. You ran out of sugar, you go to your neighbor's house. You ran out of toilet paper, you go to the neighbor's house. They come to your house. People come to their house and eat. And I remember having, like I said, it was different generations together, and they would teach you little like home remedies and home things. And you could call somebody in the family to fix something in the house, or if somebody was hurt, you had those older people who grew up. And remember those older doctors who made like hot titties is still a thing today, but that's an old thing. You get what I'm saying? So when people, if you had needed stitches, people from the farms used to get spider web and spin it around, and then put it to your in your cut, and then gauze it up, and then it heal like new and stuff like that. Like, I remember all that stuff, and people forget that about quote unquote 80s babies, right? That we had a unique experience because we got to see how America affected a lot of different generations while technology was evolving. But that's my 80s baby POV childhood. I'm going to get to the teenage thing next.